This is Ed Pullen from the Bird Banter Podcast. A couple of episodes ago, Jason Fidorra was my guest. Jason works for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife in an area of Washington that has a lot of shrub steppe habitat. And that habitat has been threatened not just from development for agriculture and green energy, but also by fire. The habitat, when it's in its native state, undisturbed, really has just sparse grass, a intact layer of this incredibly complex crust that really is fairly fire resistant. But once that is disturbed by cattle grazing or by people or other reasons, that becomes attractive to invasive species. Grasses grow more. Grasses like cheatgrass and other grasses that really form a carpet rather than have little sparse bunches of grass, and makes it much more prone to fires. And fires have been a huge threat to the shrub steppe habitat throughout the western U.S. in recent years, and are a big factor in a lot of the wildfires that we're seeing devastating this part of the country now. So I thought this was a perfect time to just take a section of that podcast and put it up here for you to hear Jason talk about the threats to the shrub steppe habitat and how that affects not just fire, but the species that depend on that habitat. Sage grouse, sage thrashers, sagebrush sparrows, ferruginous hawks, lots of burrowing animals. So I thought this would be a great time to hear what Jason had to say about that. Tell me a little bit about shrub steppe habitat. It's just a very unique sort of habitat.
So yeah, when I came out to Eastern Washington, it was kind of a newer habitat for me to kind of get to know. And even when I talk locally with folks and mention the word shrub steppe, I get a lot of blank stares. And I mean, shrub steppe is simply shrub and steppe, which is grassland habitat. So where you get this in our region, we have sagebrush is a dominant shrub type. You'll
Mm-hmm.
see several other species, including like rabbitbrush and greasewood, that make up the shrub component, depending on where you are. And then the native kind of bunch grasses that would dominate the rest of, as you get higher in elevation, it may uh, tend more towards bunch grasses. And, there's kind of two major threats in my mind right now with shrub steppe. Historically and still somewhat ongoing, there's been a lot of development pressure. These shrub steppe habitats are treeless and out in the eastern Washington area with lots of sunshine and these deep soil areas were really quickly converted for agriculture.
Sure.
So now we're going through, in at least the Tri-City area, with some further development threats with suburban kind of development as well as energy development. A lot of green energy that we're really looking towards to help benefit climate change and other pollution and species.
Right.
Um, a lot of that is solar and wind, and those are really um, currently being focused in Eastern Washington, or
Mm-hmm.
I guess, but Eastern Washington is really kind of the area that's um, a lot of that development's being focused currently. And so if you're coming out to Eastern Washington along the gorge, one of the first things you notice as soon as you get into an area with less trees is you're seeing all of these wind turbines up on the ridges, and we have a lot of pressure for wind development. More recently, there's been a lot of pressure for development for solar panel installations and
Okay.
industrial level solar sites. So those are going to have an impact on shrub steppe, and uh, the development that's already happened, is definitely fragmented and caused a big loss to intact shrub steppe. And
Right.
unfortunately, what we have left um, is mostly degraded on poor soil, and so the shrub components grow very slowly. Um, Burrowing animals don't have as much habitat availability there,
Mm-hmm.
and this habitat's really been, not only so you've got basically the worst of what was already left that hadn't been developed, and now it's been inundated with a lot of invasive species of grass and weeds that create this issue with fire. And I can talk about
Yes.
that a little bit here. If
Sure, yeah. It's a fragile habitat. I mean, I remember when Andy talked to us, the it looks like just nothing growing there. But there's actually this crust of incredible microorganisms and fungal elements and things that even a footstep that looks like there's nothing growing there anyway. What's a footstep? That is, it seriously degrades the habitat.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've seen some nicer intact shrub steppe where you still get that cryptobiotic crust and that moss and lichen kind
Hmm.
of understory, and then you get the sparse bunch grasses and wildflowers. That's a really nice intact shrub steppe site, and a site like that is really incompatible with fire in the sense that fire can't really take hold. Naturally, shrub steppe habitat would be really defensive against fire. Small fires would happen periodically, but the historical fire regime would be more on the scale of 50 to 100-year fires
Oh,
occurring
okay.
versus what we're seeing now when like you mentioned, the footsteps and trampling. Think about cattle that are being
Hmm.
grazed out there can
Sure.
really tear up that kind of understory, provides an opportunity for non-native grasses such as cheatgrass and other species to create this flammable carpet. So now where
Oh,
you have a roadside ignition or a lightning strike, which would be considered a natural fire cause, it has this unnatural result that this fire can now carry for acres and
miles.
acres. Yeah.
Yeah,
And so
miles, I'm
we've seen,
sure.
yeah, so we have seen some really large fires in eastern Washington. Um, and that the issue there is that also sagebrush, because it's adapted, to be really in a less disturbed fire regime, it doesn't really survive intense fire,
Hmm.
and the seeds don't really, the seed bed doesn't germinate, after the fire. So
Ooh.
you really need to start with bringing in new sagebrushes or seeds, and so it's a fairly
Hmm.
intensive effort to restore.
Oh boy, yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I bet. Well, the areas of sage that I've seen burned are just like moonscape. They just look horrible.
Yeah, and you might have that landscape that had sagebrush and bunch grasses, and after a fire, I mean, you can tell on the hillsides in some areas, like, oh, well, that must have burned, and that area clearly hasn't, because you can see the strict demarcation between shrubs and now grassland.
Sure.
Um, and that's kind of led to, I guess I can go in to talk about a few of the species.
Yeah,
When
please.
this eastern Washington shrub steppe, I think people think, especially with sagebrush sparrow, is a very specialized
Hmm.
species that breeds really only in intact, large, continuous acreages of shrub steppe with large intact sagebrush. Um, it's probably the most obligate species I can think of with based in the habitat.
Certainly the
Um,
hardest to find.
yeah, but when you do find them in good habitat, they're very abundant. But
Exactly.
we're losing a lot of those large intact areas. Um, and then you get into some other species. One of them that I work with is ferruginous hawk, and
Yes.
ferruginous hawk has really been a really cool species to observe. It's really a south central Washington specialty within the state.
Hmm.
Um, it likes open grassland, shrub steppe, and nests on these, cliff faces typically, although we do have them nesting sometimes on, steep scree slope or nest platforms, but usually find an outcrop, in kind of like a coulee or canyon, and you'll
Hmm.
just see these massive stick nests, and they will take really large, typically sagebrush branches, and they could be as thick as your wrist to
Oh
build
wow.
the base of this structure, and often add to that year after year. So you can, in a few places, see some really massive nests, and then assuming they don't burn, you can see these nests in the landscape, long after they've been abandoned, which unfortunately now we're down to about 22 pairs left in Washington.
Oh,
It's
wow.
been a state listed species, I think, since the 80s as threatened, which is its current status, although it's highly likely that that's going to be upgraded to a state endangered species.